There is a moment in every empire's life when it looks eternal, when a monument stands so tall that no one can imagine them falling, when a leader's voice echoes through every radio, every television, every throat forced to cheer, when a machinery of power hums so loudly that it drowns out the sound of its own decay. December 1989, Nicolae Ceaușescu stood on that balcony in Bucharest, staring down at a sea of faces he believed belonged to him. He had ruled Romania for 24 years. He had crushed dissent, rewritten history, demolished entire neighborhoods to build his palace of power. He had turned himself into more than a leader. He had become the state itself. His face was everywhere. His name was in every textbook. Children sang songs about him. Adults applauded on command. And yet, in 4 days, he would be dead, shot against a wall on Christmas Day, like a rabid animal put down in haste. How does a dictator who controls everything lose everything in 96 hours? This is not a question about one man. This is a question about the architecture of power itself. Because what happened to Ceaușescu happens to every empire, every system, every structure that believes it has conquered time. They don't fall because they're weak. They fall because they become so rigid, so convinced of their own permanence, that they can no longer sense the ground shifting beneath them. Power is not what it appears to be. When we look at empires, we see armies, we see palaces, we see leaders who seem untouchable. But power is not force. Power is belief. It is the collective agreement that a certain order exists, that certain people command, that certain rules cannot be broken. Every dictatorship, every kingdom, every superpower in history has rested on this invisible foundation. The Roman legions did not hold the empire together. The belief in Rome did. The British Navy did not control a quarter of the Earth's surface. The belief in British supremacy did. And when belief cracks, when the story people tell themselves about who rules and why begins to unravel, the entire structure comes apart with shocking speed. Ceaușescu understood this once. In his early years, he was pragmatic, calculating, intelligent. He played the West against the Soviet Union, cultivating an image of independence while maintaining authoritarian control at home. He opened Romania to Western trade, hosted Richard Nixon, received medals and honors from democratic governments who saw him as a useful buffer against Soviet dominance. He built his power not just through fear, but through carefully managed perception. He was the communist leader who defied Moscow, the strong man who brought stability, the architect of Romania's industrial ambition. But somewhere in the machinery of total control, something fundamental broke. It always does, because absolute power creates a feedback loop that destroys the very capacity that built it. When you eliminate all opposition, you eliminate all information. When everyone must agree with you, no one can tell you the truth. When dissent becomes treason, reality becomes whatever you declare it to be. Ceaușescu began to believe his own propaganda. He built himself a palace that dwarfed Versailles, demolishing ancient neighborhoods and displacing tens of thousands of people to construct a monument to his own ego. He created a cult of personality so extreme that his wife, Elena, a woman with barely a high school education, was declared a world-renowned scientist. Academic journals published her research. Universities granted her honorary degrees. Reality bent to accommodate the fiction. And because everyone pretended to believe it, he believed everyone believed it. This is the trap that kills empires. They become echo chambers of their own mythology. The Roman emperors who declared themselves gods. The Chinese dynasties that built forbidden cities to separate themselves from their people. The Soviet leadership that published economic statistics showing endless growth while store shelves sat empty. They were not lying to the world. They had begun lying to themselves. The machinery of repression accelerates this decay. Ceaușescu built one of the most extensive secret police networks in the communist world. The Securitate infiltrated every layer of Romanian society. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Family members reported on family members. Conversations in private homes were monitored. Typewriters were registered with the state so that dissident documents could be traced. It was a system designed to eliminate the possibility of organized resistance. And it worked for decades. But surveillance states develop a fatal weakness. They become so focused on controlling their population that they lose the ability to understand it. The reports flowing to Ceaușescu's desk told him what his system was designed to hear. That people loved him, that the economy was thriving, that Romania was ascending to greatness. The Securitate arrested anyone who contradicted this narrative, which meant the narrative could never be corrected. He had built a perfect system for maintaining power. He had also built a perfect system for becoming blind. This is why empires fall suddenly. Not because the collapse comes from nowhere, but because the structure of power prevents leaders from seeing it coming. The warning signs accumulate in silence, invisible to those at the top, until the system reaches a breaking point and shatters in what looks like an instant. The economic reality beneath Ceaușescu's delusions was catastrophic. He had taken massive loans from Western banks in the 1970s to industrialize Romania, to build factories and infrastructure to compete with the advanced economies of Europe. But instead of generating prosperity, these projects became monuments to waste and corruption. The debt mounted. Rather than admit failure, Ceaușescu decided to repay every penny of foreign debt to maintain Romania's independence and his own image as a strong leader. He imposed austerity measures that turned Romania into a ghost of itself. Food was rationed to levels that produced malnutrition. Electricity was cut to a few hours a day. Heat in winter became a luxury most people could not afford. Hospitals ran without medicine. Factories operated without parts. And through it all, Ceaușescu built his palace through lavish ceremonies and declared that Romania was achieving unprecedented success. The gap between the official narrative and lived reality became a chasm. But the system was still locked in place. The fear was still there. The surveillance was still functioning. The mechanisms of control seemed unbreakable until they weren't. Because there is something that no empire, no matter how powerful, can ultimately control. The moment when fear transforms into fury. When people stop asking whether they can resist and start realizing they must. This transformation doesn't happen through planning. It happens through contagion. December 16th, 1989, in the city of Timișoara, a Hungarian pastor named Laszlo Tokes was scheduled to be evicted by authorities. A small group gathered to protect him. The Securitate tried to disperse them. More people arrived. The crowd grew. And then something unexpected happened. People stopped running when police advanced. They stood their ground. They started shouting. Not carefully, not cautiously, but with the raw anger of people who had been silent too long. The protests spread through Timișoara like fire. Ceaușescu, confident in his control, ordered a crackdown. Security forces opened fire. People died in the streets. And instead of crushing the uprising, the violence ignited it. News spread to other cities. Bucharest began to stir. The tyrant who had seemed untouchable 72 hours earlier was now struggling to contain a revolt that was growing by the hour. On December 21st, Ceaușescu organized a massive rally in Bucharest to demonstrate his unshakable support. Tens of thousands were assembled in the square, transported by state buses, required to attend, holding banners and photos of their leader, as they had done countless times before. The scene was identical to 1,000 previous rallies. The ritual of power playing out is scripted. Ceaușescu stepped onto the balcony and began to speak. His voice, amplified through loudspeakers, echoed across the square with the same slogans, the same certainty, the same assumption of obedience. And then, in the middle of his speech, something impossible happened. Someone shouted. Others joined. The sound of dissent rose from the crowd, chaotic and uncontrolled. Ceaușescu stopped speaking. His face, broadcast live on state television to every corner of Romania, showed confusion, then fear. For 8 seconds, he stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was occurring. 8 seconds of silence that destroyed 24 years of illusion. Because in that moment, the spell broke. Millions watching saw a dictator who looked powerless. The myth of invincibility shattered on live television. By nightfall, Bucharest was in open revolt. The structures of power that had seemed absolute revealed themselves as hollow. The security forces, the party officials, the apparatchiks who had enforced the regime for decades began to calculate their own survival. Some tried to suppress the uprising. Others switched sides. The military, seeing the tide turning, refused to fire on crowds. Ceaușescu and his wife fled the capital by helicopter, convinced they could regroup, reassert control, remind everyone who held power. But they were ghosts fleeing a system that had already died. They were arrested within hours by their own military. The trial was a formality. The execution was swift. And just like that, a man who had ruled absolutely, who had controlled every lever of the state, who had built palaces and monuments to his own permanence, was erased. Not gradually, not after years of decline, but in 4 days. This is the pattern that repeats across history with mechanical precision. Empires do not fall because they are conquered by stronger enemies. They fall because they lose the ability to adapt, to respond, to hear the signals of their own decay. The Roman Empire did not fall to barbarians at its height. It fell after centuries of internal corruption, economic strain, and military overextension made the barbarians irrelevant. They merely pushed over a structure that had already hollowed itself out. The Soviet Union did not collapse because NATO defeated it militarily. It collapsed because the centralized control that had built its power became the mechanism of its paralysis. When Gorbachev tried to reform the system, he discovered that the only thing holding it together was force. And when force was relaxed, the entire structure disintegrated in months. The pattern is always the same. Rigidity masquerading as strength. Control mistaken for stability. And then, when the ground shifts, when the population no longer believes, when the economics no longer function, when the mythology no longer holds, the collapse comes with terrifying speed. We watch this pattern play out today in slow motion. Superpowers that believe they are permanent. Leaders who centralize power and eliminate dissent in the name of strength. Economies built on narratives that diverge increasingly from reality. The mechanisms are more sophisticated now. Surveillance is digital. Propaganda is algorithmic. Control is globalized. But the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged because power at its core is still belief. And belief, when it rests on lies, on force, on the suppression of truth, becomes fragile. Ceaușescu stood on that balcony in December 1989, thinking he was addressing his people. He was actually addressing an audience that no longer existed. The Romania he ruled lived only in his mind, and in the reports his system generated to confirm his delusions. The real Romania, hungry, cold, exhausted, and furious, was waiting for the moment when someone would shout first. That is the lesson history repeats endlessly. Empires fall overnight because they spent years building the conditions of their collapse in silence. The question is never whether the powerful will fall. The question is only whether they will see it coming. And history suggests, with depressing consistency, that they never do.